Hey Steph, it's Friday. Today I want to talk to you about some stuff that is actually pretty gross. You're going to be very glad that you don't have to think about this all day. In fact, it's extremely lucky that our brains are capable of forgetting lots of important facts about the world just so we can keep on living. You'll see what I mean. First up, did you know that we have 10 times more bacteria in our bodies than we do human cells? The only real consolation is that our cells are much heavier than bacteria, so they only make up a small percentage of our total weight, actually only about a few pounds. As well, almost all this bacteria is actually supposed to be there, and it's working hard for us, digesting food, keeping bad bacteria from making us sick, among other things. Next up, when you flush a toilet, did you know that there's actually fecal bacteria that's sprayed up into the air with every single flush? People commonly use this to tell you that you shouldn't use a toothbrush and leave it in the bathroom near the toilet. But this actually implies something much worse. Basically, when you flush a toilet every time, you're releasing this bacteria from poop into the air, and it gets everywhere. It doesn't just immediately settle, it hangs in the air for minutes. And so it gets everywhere. And basically, since you don't see millions of cases of pink eye every year, it's a pretty safe bet that it's really not that bad for you in small concentrations. Think for a second about watching somebody smoke in public. Pretty gross, right? If the person's extremely inconsiderate, sometimes they actually blow smoke directly into your face and into your mouth. Consider this. You can see it when they're smoking because of the fumes, but anytime anybody breathes ever, this is happening with their regular breath. This means that we're constantly breathing the exact same air that someone around you just breathed. On a side note, it's typically thought that when you inhale, you take all the oxygen out of that air, but you actually inhale air that's about 20% oxygen, and you exhale air that's between about 15% oxygen. So really, you wouldn't even notice if you're breathing someone else's air. Water is another thing we don't really think about in terms of day-to-day life. Because we've taken all the danger out of water by cleaning it, purifying it, and filtering it, there's really not much risk to it. That being said, there can be a ton of stuff in water without you being able to taste it, just because volumes of water are so big that it's basically mathematically impossible to completely purify it. I don't know if you heard, but there was a story recently about a guy in the US who urinated drunkenly into a reservoir that had 37 million gallons of not drinking water, but water that had been purified to become drinking water. And there was a whole to-do, and they wanted to dump the 37 million gallons of water because of this 1 to 2 cups of urine. In the end, they decided it wasn't worth it to dump out this water, and that's probably a good thing, because if you do the math, which I just did, you get about 2 parts per billion of urine in water, which is well below thresholds, well below thresholds for clean water. And so, urine in water, if it's that much, you're not going to taste it, you're not going to notice it. It's going to take really, really, really precise measurements to be able to even measure it once it's diluted throughout the entire 37 million gallons. As well, insect parts are actually an extremely common part of food. When you process food, inevitably a lot of insects are going to get caught in this process, and it's not worth it for industry to filter that kind of stuff out. So these kinds of things are just mashed or ground into processed food. Things like chocolate, peanut butter, and pretty much every other processed food, they're not required to remove excess insect parts or some other debris, as long as it's not dangerous, from food products. And actually, this kind of market is regulated, and there's actually a minimum acceptable level of insect parts in most foods. For instance, peanut butter, you're allowed 30 pieces per 100 grams, 30 insect pieces per 100 grams. Chocolate, 60 pieces per 100 grams. It would actually be impossible to make most processed foods at the scale we consume them without these kinds of regulations, without these allowances for insect parts. And avoiding foods that don't do this is pretty difficult too, because the limits that I mentioned in the examples aren't particularly high. Cinnamon, for example, you can have 400 insect fragments per 50 grams. Last but not least, this is a pretty innocuous one, but it's pretty gross nonetheless. Think for a second about how quickly you can smell a fart after someone's let one rip. That is how fast gas can travel through the air on a regular basis. The sulfur compounds that provide the smell of a fart aren't the only things in the fart, they're just the strongest smelling ones. Same thing goes for pretty much anything bad you can smell, or good you can smell. The mere fact that you can actually smell anything means that particles from that thing have entered into your nose. Mix that with the fact that there's literally nothing you can do to avoid any of this, and I'm really glad that humans can forget these kinds of things as we're going through our day-to-day lives, or things would get really difficult. Anyways, that's it for this week. So sleep tight and try not to think about the dust mites that are inside your mattress. They're the reason that it gets so heavy by the time you try to get rid of it. I love you, and I'll see you Wednesday.